Hi, I'm Phil, and I'm part of the team here at Warwick. And I brought with me today my old laptop, the old Toshiba. It kind of looks like a Tesla Cybertruck. And I've had this thing for about 15 years. And it suffers with some of the shared infirmities of laptops of that age. It doesn't work, of course, unless I've got the power pack plugged in, the battery's fried. It chugs a little bit when we're starting it up. And of course, whenever you load an application of any kind, it sounds like the laptop's about to launch off. But here's the thing. I love this laptop. I love the keyboard. I love the trackpad. I've done a lot of great work on this laptop. I've prepared a lot of messages. I've done assignments for Bible college, all kinds of things. So I like this old laptop. It's kind of dear to me, but it's also pretty old and kind of terrible. But something happens every now and again. You probably got this with an old computer, an old laptop at home, that you go to shut it down, and then you get this message where you can choose update and shut down. And I'm like, my old laptop's still getting updates. This is amazing. And then there's part of me that thinks this update could fix some of the issues. This update, maybe it'll make the battery work again. Maybe this update will make it start up faster. Maybe this update will sort out the issue with the fan. And of course, that's never going to happen. The little update to Microsoft Word isn't going to make my laptop's GPU magically perform better. The little update to Google Calendars isn't going to fix the GPU and bring it up to modern day standards. So one of the things that we sometimes have to get to in life is the ability to discern when something needs an update versus when something just needs a complete renewal, a complete overhaul. And I'm sad to say it, but my Tesla Cybertruck Toshiba is at the point where no update's going to solve it. No matter how much I love it, it needs more than an update. It needs a complete renewing. You know, one of the things that Jesus spoke about so often throughout the Gospels is this idea of the renewal that is found in relationship with Jesus. Now, in Luke chapter 5, there's a wonderful story that precedes a really important parable. And some people came to Jesus, probably some of his opponents, and they noticed there was a difference between his disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees or the disciples of John. And they kind of said, Jesus, we don't get it. The disciples of the Pharisees of John, they fast like all the time. They're fasting, they're praying, they're kind of serious, Jesus. And every time we look up, we see your disciples having dinner at another person's house. They're eating, they're having a glass of wine, there's laughter. It just kind of seems like they're partying all the time, Jesus. And really what they've identified is the disciples of Jesus seem to have a different set of religious practices than the disciples of the Pharisees and the disciples of John. And they're like, Jesus, we don't understand. This kind of seems bad that your disciples aren't fasting like other disciples. What's going on with that, Jesus? And then Jesus begins by telling a really cool story. He says, if you're at a wedding, you're not going to fast at that wedding. In fact, to celebrate and be joyful with the bridegroom, with the bride, with everything that's happening on, you support them by being a part of that feast. So no one kind of goes along to a wedding and fasts. You go and support what's going on by being a part of the feast. And really what Jesus was getting at is that the Messiah had stepped into the world and the disciples are a part of that. I love Eugene Peterson's paraphrase of this verse. He says, this is kingdom come. I have stepped into the world, and when my disciples are with me, we're going to be joyful in each other's presence. Now, he does continue, and he says a time is coming, speaking of his death, his resurrection, and the changing, shifting context of the presence of Jesus in our world. And he says a time's coming where they will fast in order to focus their lives of prayer to be with me. That's coming. But right now, it's wedding celebration time. This is kingdom come. And then Jesus goes on, and we're beginning to get the sense from the passage in chapter 5 that he's starting to speak into the difference between the old covenant of justification by works and the new covenant of justification by faith and grace through Jesus. And he gives us two parables in one. And he begins with that of the new and the old garment. And he says, no one takes an old garment that's torn. Imagine I've got a big hole in my grey shirt here. And I buy a brand new t-shirt, but it's white. And then I cut out of that brand new white t-shirt a patch to go on my old grey shirt here. And he says, no one does that because you destroy the whole new shirt just to fix the old. And then the color doesn't even match. So it doesn't work for what was old, and it destroys what is new. And then he pivots and he starts to talk about wine. And it's a parable that maybe you're familiar with, the parable of the old and the new wineskins. And Jesus again says, no one takes new wine and pours it into old wineskins. If you do that, it's gonna burst, it's gonna ruin the skins, and the new wine's gonna be wasted and spilled out. He says, no, you take new wine and you pour it into new wineskins. Now, as I try to get my head around this parable and how wine worked in the world that Jesus was speaking into, we've got to get a little macabre for just a second. So wineskins were made out of animal skins, and the new wine would be poured into these new wineskins. And what was important about the new skins is that they had some flex to them. They had a bit of stretch factor to the skin. So as the new wine was poured in, they could stretch and move with the new volume of the new wine. They had some flexibility to them. But when the skins got old, they became rigid, they became hard, they lost that ability to flex. So as new wine and the new volume of wine was poured in, they've lost that stretch, that flexibility. And the wineskins break and burst, and the new wine pours out everywhere. Now, there's a wonderful picture here as Jesus continues. I think he does two things. The first, he's talking about the old Judaistic structure and religious practice of the old covenant and justification through works. He's saying that old approach to relationship with God, it doesn't work anymore. We can't just pour the gospel of Jesus into that old wineskin and expect it to work. And part of what Jesus is saying in response to his opponent's criticism is that my disciples are experiencing the new wine of the new covenant. I'm not going to patch that back into what was. There's actually a new paradigm, a new creation, and my disciples are beginning to experience it. So Jesus says, the new covenant of my blood, the wine poured out through the death and resurrection of Christ, actually requires a new kind of container, a new way of approaching God. So on one hand, he's speaking into the religious practice of the day. But I think on the other hand, and this is where I can step into the text here, is that he's speaking to the quality of the heart. So as we receive the renewing of the gospel, the new wine of Jesus pouring into my life, is the container of my life, is the container of my heart, is it rigid like an old wineskin, or does it have flex like a new wineskin? Because the work of the gospel coming into our lives is living and it's active. And you know, for Jesus and the world that he lived in, the wineskins had an interesting extra quality. That it was actually really important for those skins to have flex in them because the new wine being poured in was still fermenting. It was active. It was in motion. It was producing carbon dioxide as it fermented. And if there was no flex in those wineskins, the gas that's produced would literally cause an explosion and wine would just go everywhere. It's the same today through fermenting processes. We need fancy airlocks so that the gas can escape and not cause explosions. So there's this idea of the gospel having this living quality and it's poured into our lives. Now, if there's rigidity in my heart, I can't flex to the new shape of Jesus being poured into me. Let's think about this in real kind of tangible ways for each of us. Let's say one of the things that we know about the kingdom of Jesus is that it's all about sacrificial love. It's all about generosity. And as we head towards Easter and think about the cross, it's an act of sacrificial love, which is God generously giving his son. So part of the shape of Jesus being poured into me is that of sacrificial generosity. Now, as that aspect of Christhood is poured into me, if there's a rigidity in who I am that says, I see that in the kingdom of Jesus, but I've got some hesitation about it in my own life, and I'm rigid to the idea of becoming generous as he was generous, what happens is that gift of the shape of Christ being poured into me, it's wasted because my heart is too rigid to contain it and it spills out. Or maybe it's an issue of forgiveness, That as the newness of the gospel is poured into me, I receive the shape of the grace and the forgiveness of Christ. As we pray in the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our debts as we forgive those indebted to us. And so if there's a rigidity in my heart, in my soul that says, Jesus, I know the shape of forgiveness in your gospel, but I can't do it. I'm not going to let that part of my heart become soft. Again, the gift of the shape of Christ is spilled out and wasted in me. So to receive the gospel of Jesus, true renewal, it's about the newness of who Christ is being poured into our lives. But it's also about the willingness to have a newness of heart to receive the shape of Jesus being poured into us. You know, sometimes I think about the heart, and circling back to that idea, is my relationship with Christ an update to who I am? Or is my relationship with Christ a complete renewing? Is my relationship with Christ something that adds an extra chamber to my heart, if you like? Or is my relationship with Christ something that completely recasts my heart, that changes my heart so that my life can have flex to contain the fullness of the gospel? It's about being something new, discovering something new. So if you're like me, and you're wrestling with this idea, and you want to know, okay, what does it mean to have a newness of self alongside the newness of the gospel in me? That I want to have this flexible heart so that my life can take on the shape of Jesus and his kingdom. But how do I get there? How can it become something more that's just an addition to my life, an update to my life? You know, I think it begins with belief. What do I believe about who Jesus is? What do I believe about what relationship with him brings to my life? Because I'm kind of convinced that desire follows belief. You know, a little while ago, I was at an actual wedding, and I had what was the greatest spring roll I've had in my life. And something you got to know about me, as far as hors d'oeuvres go, spring rolls are like right there at the top. I'm not sure if hors d'oeuvres was the right word. You can let me know in the comments. But I discovered the greatest spring roll I've ever experienced in my life. It was like the size of like a large sausage roll. It was like uniquely massive. It was so good. And I eyeballed it as the wait staff were coming around and giving out the food. And I was like, I've got to get one of those. And sure enough, it delivered like nothing else. I ate this thing. I was like, this is incredible. This in fact, is the best spring roll that I've ever had. And then I learned something new about that spring roll. This is the best thing I've ever had. I had a belief connected to that spring roll that I have never had a spring roll as good as this. And then that belief created desire in me so that when the spring rolls started coming out, I was beginning to position myself so I could get as many of those spring rolls as possible. And I'm not proud of how many spring rolls I ate that night. But my belief created desire and then impacted my positioning. So there was belief, desire followed, and then positioning or action came in response to my belief and to my desire. So what do we believe about who Jesus is? How is it cultivating desire for who he is? And how am I allowing my life to follow my desire and my belief in Christ? I wonder if there's some things about Jesus that you need to hold on to, that you need to remember, that you need to take hold of, and do an inventory. Jesus, what do I believe about who you are? And my encouragement as we come to our end of our time focused on Luke chapter 5 here is to start here. To say, what do you believe about Jesus? If you're a journaler, if you're a note taker, maybe write that question down. Jesus, what do I believe about you? Write some things down and then begin to say, God, help me to shape my life with flex in my heart so I can live out what I believe it means to follow you. God bless you.